The morning sun cast long shadows through the grimy windows of the Millbrook County Courthouse, illuminating dust motes that danced like secrets in the stifling air. The courtroom smelled of old wood, stale coffee, and something else. Something harder to name but impossible to ignore. Fear, perhaps. Or resignation. The kind that settles into institutions when justice becomes performance and power corrupts purpose. Derrick Cole stepped through the heavy oak doors with the measured pace of a man who had nothing to prove and everything to observe. His charcoal suit was impeccable, pressed to knife-edge precision, the fabric moving with him like liquid authority. His leather briefcase bore the subtle patina of quality, not ostentation. Italian leather aged to perfection, the kind that whispered rather than shouted about its owner's success. But in this room, steeped in decades of prejudice and provincial thinking, none of that seemed to matter. The gallery was sparse, a handful of clerks shuffling papers with the mechanical precision of those who had long ago stopped seeing the human drama unfolding before them, a bailiff whose uniform strained against his considerable belly and whose eyes held the tired cynicism of a man who had witnessed too much injustice to be surprised by it anymore, and scattered townsfolk who had wandered in to witness the morning's proceedings like spectators at a gladiatorial contest. Their eyes followed Derrick as he made his way down the center aisle, and he felt the familiar weight of their assumptions settling on his shoulders like an unwelcome coat. Assumptions about who he was, where he came from, and what he deserved. At the bench sat Judge Richard Whitman, a man whose 63 years had been kind to his ego but cruel to his soul. His black robe draped him like a shroud of authority, and beneath silver hair that he combed with the vanity of a man who still believed in his own mythology, his pale eyes surveyed his domain with the satisfaction of a king in his castle. For 30 years, he had presided over this courtroom with absolute power, dispensing what he called justice, but what others might recognize as systematic oppression wrapped in legal procedure. He wielded that power like a weapon against those he deemed beneath him, which, in his worldview, included anyone who didn't look like him, think like him, or submit to his particular brand of Southern authority. The judge's gavel lay before him like a scepter, its wooden handle worn smooth by decades of angry strikes against defendants who had dared to challenge his interpretation of law and order. His nameplate gleamed under the fluorescent lights. The Honourable Judge Richard Whitman. But honour, Derrick mused as he surveyed the scene before him, was something earned through consistent ethical behaviour, not engraved on brass and displayed for intimidation. "Next case," Whitman announced, his voice carrying the lazy authority of a man who had never been meaningfully challenged, never faced real consequences for his actions. "Traffic violation. Derrick." He squinted at the docket, his pronunciation deliberately careless, designed to diminish and dismiss. "Cole." Derrick stepped forward to the defendant's table, noting the worn wood scarred with decades of nervous fingers and desperate grips from those who had stood here before him. The table told stories of immigrants who barely spoke English facing deportation hearings, of single mothers caught between impossible choices, of young men whose futures hung in the balance of this man's mood. He placed his briefcase beside it but did not sit, his posture straight, hands clasped behind his back, not the stance of a man seeking mercy, but of one who commanded respect through presence alone. "You're here for speeding," Whitman said without looking up from his papers, his tone suggesting that the outcome had already been decided. 67 in a 45 zone on Highway 9. "Yes, Your Honour." The response was crisp, professional, carrying no trace of the deference Whitman expected and demanded. The judge's head snapped up at the sound of Derrick's voice, rich, educated, steady, carrying the unmistakable authority of a man accustomed to being heard in rooms where decisions that shaped lives and nations were made. Not what he had expected from the black man in the expensive suit. Whitman's eyes narrowed as they took in the defendant before him, cataloguing details that didn't fit his preconceptions. The expensive suit that fit like it had been tailored rather than bought off the rack. The confident bearing that spoke of boardrooms and federal courthouses. The quiet dignity that refused to be diminished by circumstance or intimidation. Where are you from, boy? The word hung in the air like smoke from a fire that should have been extinguished decades ago, a relic of an era that men like Whitman refused to let die. The gallery stirred uneasily, some recognizing the loaded nature of the term, others nodding in approval at their judge's direct approach. The bailiff shifted his weight, uncomfortable with the charged atmosphere, but uncertain whether to intervene. Even the clerk's typing faltered for a moment before resuming its mechanical rhythm, the sound seeming to echo the heartbeat of a courtroom holding its breath. Derrick's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the only sign that the slur had found its mark. But his voice remained steady, professional, giving his tormentor nothing to grasp. I'm from many places, Your Honor. Currently residing in Washington, D.C. Washington. Whitman leaned back in his chair, a thin smile playing at the corners of his mouth like a predator savoring the moment before the kill. Big city man, are we? Coming through our little town, thinking our laws don't apply to you, thinking you can speed through here like you own the place. The accusation carried undertones that everyone in the courtroom understood, but few would acknowledge. It wasn't about speeding. It was about knowing your place, about understanding the natural order of things, about accepting that some people belonged and others were merely tolerated. I respect all laws, Your Honor. I was rushing to make an appointment and failed to notice the speed limit change. I take full responsibility for my actions. The honesty was disarming in its simplicity, but Whitman had built his reputation on never being disarmed. He had presided over countless cases where defendants tried to charm their way out of consequences with sob stories, excuses, and calculated displays of remorse. This one was different, though. There was something in his eyes, a depth that suggested rivers running far deeper than they appeared on the surface. Full responsibility, Whitman repeated mockingly, his voice dripping with sarcasm. How noble, how convenient. He flipped through the file with theatrical indifference, taking his time, making the defendant wait because he could. Says here you were clocked at 22 miles over the limit. That's reckless driving in my book. Your Honor, with respect, the citation was written for simple speeding. Don't tell me how to read, son. The word son dripped with condescension, another verbal weapon in Whitman's arsenal of humiliation. I've been sitting on this bench longer than you've been alive, probably. I know what I'm looking at, and I know how to interpret the law in my jurisdiction. The bailiff nodded approvingly, his loyalty absolute. Several gallery members murmured their agreement, a Greek chorus supporting their local authority figure. This was the Judge Whitman they knew and expected, firm, uncompromising, putting uppity outsiders in their place with the kind of rough justice that kept their community safe from unwelcome influences. But Derrick didn't flinch. His breathing remained steady, his gaze unwavering, his hands still clasped behind his back with military precision. There was something almost peaceful about his stillness, like a lake before a storm, calm on the surface, but suggesting tremendous power held in reserve. Of course, Your Honor. I meant no disrespect. Whitman studied him with the intensity of a hunter tracking prey, searching for the crack in his composure that always came. They all broke eventually. The defendants, the lawyers, the witnesses who thought they could challenge his authority. The moment of capitulation was his favorite part of any proceeding. The instant when defiance crumbled into submission and the natural order reasserted itself. But this man seemed carved from something harder than the others, forged in fires that had burned away everything except essential strength. What kind of work do you do in Washington? Whitman asked, leaning forward like a prosecutor himself, though he had never possessed the skills that title required. The question carried the weight of an interrogation, designed to expose weakness and establish dominance. I work for the federal government. Doing what? Legal work. The answers were truthful but minimal, and each one seemed to irritate the judge more. Whitman was accustomed to defendants who either groveled desperately for mercy or challenged him directly in ways that justified his harshest responses. This quiet confidence was something new, something that made him uncomfortable in a way he couldn't quite name. like a predator suddenly uncertain whether he was hunting or being hunted. Legal work, Whitman repeated, his voice thick with skepticism and barely contained disdain. Public defender, legal aid. One of those bleeding heart organizations that come down here trying to tell us how to run our communities? Something like that. Something like that. The judge's face darkened like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. He had dealt with their type before, liberal lawyers from the city, coming to small towns with their fancy degrees and their superiority complexes, thinking they could lecture good people about right and wrong, about the way things should be versus the way things had always been. Well, Mr. Cole, let me give you some legal education about how things work in my courtroom. Whitman's voice rose, filling every corner of the chamber with 30 years of unchecked authority. I don't care what kind of fancy legal aid society sent you here, or what kind of social justice agenda you're pushing. In this room, I am the law. I am judge, jury, and the final word on what constitutes justice. The gallery was completely silent now, tension thick enough to cut. Even the clerk had stopped typing, her fingers frozen above the keys. All eyes were on the tall black man standing before the bench, waiting to see if he would finally break. Under the weight of the judge's authority, if he would crumble like so many others had before him. But Derrick simply nodded, his acceptance somehow more unsettling than defiance would have been. I understand, Your Honor. Do you? Do you really? Whitman's face was flushed now, his voice carrying 30 years of unchecked power, and the frustration of a man whose favorite weapon, intimidation, seemed to be failing him. Because I'm looking at a man who thinks the rules don't apply to him, a man who speeds through our community, endangering our citizens, then stands before me with that attitude. The word attitude fell like a slap, loaded with meanings that everyone in the courtroom understood, but few would acknowledge. It was code, the kind of language that allowed prejudice to hide behind plausible deniability. Your Honor, I've shown nothing but respect. Respect! Whitman slammed his palm on the bench with enough force to make the gavel jump. Respect would be following our speed limits. Respect would be showing proper deference in my courtroom instead of standing there, like you own the place, like you're better than the rest of us. The attack was vicious and personal, designed to humiliate and break. The gallery watched in fascination and horror as their judge dismantled this outsider piece by piece, each word calculated to strip away dignity and reduce a man to his most vulnerable elements. This was justice as they understood it, swift, severe, and unforgiving to those who didn't belong in their ordered world. But something extraordinary happened. Instead of crumbling under the assault, Derrick seemed to grow more solid, more present. His silence wasn't submission. It was the quiet of deep water, vast and untroubled by surface storms. There was power in his stillness, authority in his refusal to be diminished. I apologize if my demeanor has offended you, Your Honor. The apology was perfect in its emptiness, giving Whitman nothing to attack while surrendering nothing of substance. It was the response of a man who had navigated far more treacherous waters than this small-town tyrant could imagine, who had faced down senators and federal judges and emerged victorious through preparation and principle rather than bluster and bias. Whitman sensed it too, the feeling that he was facing something beyond his experience, and it enraged him. This defendant was supposed to be broken by now, begging for mercy, acknowledging the natural order of things and his place within it. Instead, he stood there with that infuriating calm, as if he knew something the judge didn't, as if he possessed some secret knowledge that rendered all of Whitman's posturing meaningless. Standard fine for speeding is $200, Whitman announced, his voice carrying across the silent courtroom like a death sentence. But reckless endangerment of our community, combined with your obvious lack of remorse and respect, for this court calls for a stronger message. He paused, savoring the moment like fine wine. This was his favorite part, the instant when he reminded defendants exactly who held their fate in his hands, when he demonstrated the awesome power of his position. I'm fining you $1,500, plus court costs, cash only, to be paid before you leave this building." The pronouncement hit the courtroom like a physical blow. Gasps echoed through the gallery, sharp intakes of breath from people who understood exactly what $1,500 meant to ordinary families. Even by Whitman's standards, it was excessive. Punishment designed not just to sting, but to devastate, to ensure that this uppity outsider would never forget his lesson in local authority. But as every eye in the courtroom fixed on Derrick Cole, waiting for the inevitable collapse, something unprecedented happened. Without hesitation, without protest, without even a flicker of concern crossing his features, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a leather wallet, not the thin, desperate billfold of a man living paycheck to paycheck, but the substantial wallet of someone for whom money was a tool rather than a constant worry. He opened it and began counting out $100 bills with the casual efficiency of a man for whom $1,500 was an inconvenience, not a catastrophe. The crisp bills appeared on the defendant's table like an accusation against every assumption the courtroom had made about him. The silence that followed was deafening, not the expectant quiet of an audience waiting for entertainment, but the stunned hush that follows when reality shifts beneath your feet and everything you thought you knew proves to be illusion. $1,500, Your Honor, plus court costs. Derrick's voice remained level, unchanged by the financial assault he'd just weathered. Judge Whitman stared at the money as if it had materialized from thin air, his carefully constructed worldview cracking like old paint. In his experience, defendants who could casually produce that kind of cash usually hired lawyers, expensive lawyers who knew how to make his life difficult, who understood federal oversight and civil rights law. They didn't stand alone in his courtroom, absorbing his abuse with supernatural calm. "Well," Whitman said, his voice slightly hoarse as he struggled to regain his footing, "at least you can pay for your mistakes. Though I suspect that money didn't come from any honest legal aid salary." The implication hung heavy in the air like smoke from a toxic fire. Drug money, stolen money, money that a man like Derrick, black, confident, unbroken, couldn't possibly have earned legitimately in Whitman's narrow understanding of the world. The judge's meaning was crystal clear to everyone present, another layer of insult designed to diminish and degrade. "I work hard for everything I have, Your Honor." The response carried quiet dignity, refusing to dignify the accusation with detailed defense. "I'm sure you do." Whitman's tone suggested the opposite, each word dripping with skepticism. "What exactly is your position with this legal aid organization?" It was then that Derrick Cole delivered the words that would shatter everything. "I'm a federal prosecutor." The phrase dropped into the silence like a stone into still water, sending ripples of shock through every corner of the courtroom. Federal prosecutor. Not a public defender scrambling for scraps, not a legal aid lawyer fighting losing battles for pocket change, not some community organizer with a law degree and noble intentions. A federal prosecutor, someone who put criminals behind bars, someone who wielded the full authority of the United States government, someone who could end careers and destroy lives with a single well-crafted indictment. Judge Whitman felt the first flicker of real unease, but his arrogance quickly smothered it like a pillow over flame. Prosecutors came in all varieties, from overworked district attorneys in struggling counties to fresh law school graduates cutting their teeth on minor cases. This man, for all his expensive clothes and unshakable calm, was still standing in his courtroom as a defendant. "A federal prosecutor," Whitman repeated, leaning back in his chair with forced casualness. Well, so you put criminals in jail for a living, then turn around and break the law yourself. How perfectly hypocritical." But Derrick's next words would prove that the real revelation was yet to come. "Assistant United States Attorney, Southern District of New York. I specialize in civil rights violations and federal crimes." The second bombshell hit the courtroom, like lightning striking twice in the same spot. Southern District of New York, the most prestigious prosecutor's office in the country, the office that had brought down mob bosses and Wall Street titans, corrupt politicians and international terrorists. Civil rights violations, the kind of federal crimes that could send judges to prison for decades. As the full implications crashed over the courtroom like a tsunami of realization, Judge Richard Whitman finally understood that he had just spent the morning systematically violating the civil rights of one of the most powerful prosecutors in America, and every word of it had been recorded. The transformation was complete. What had begun as a routine traffic stop had become a masterclass in how justice could turn the tables on injustice, how truth could emerge from the most unlikely circumstances, and how power, real power, came not from the ability to intimidate others, but from the strength to maintain dignity in the face of those who would try to take it away. As Derrick Cole walked out of that courtroom, he left behind more than just $2,700. He left behind a changed institution, a humbled judge, and the proof that sometimes the most powerful response to hatred is not to fight fire with fire, but to let truth burn away everything false until only justice remains. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful true stories. Drop a comment with your thoughts and tell us, what truth are you brave enough to speak today?